Recently, I read 17 great books from the independent publisher Milkweed, and today I'm going to share the 5 great nonfiction books from that group of 17 that I read and loved. And if you stick around until the end, I'll share an even longer list of more nonfiction books published recently or soon to be published by Milkweed. I only scratched the surface of Milkweed's amazing catalog, but I managed to convince myself of the value of reading deeply into one particular independent publisher, especially a publisher with a vision as strong as Milkweed. There were so many issues and subjects and themes that crossed over all 17 of these books, and it was an absolute joy to discover them. By the way, I'm Sarah, and I love to read books from independent publishers and then come to YouTube to talk about them, so welcome. In an interview in 2016, Milkweed Editions shared that particularly for their nonfiction books, they're looking to publish works with an ecological sensibility. And the word ecology comes up a lot in Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, one of Milkweed's amazing books. And Kimmerer points out that the word ecology comes from the Greek word for home. And I'd argue that every book I read from Milkweed, fiction, poetry, and these books of nonfiction involve this idea of home, both the very local places and communities we call home, all the way out to the planet that we call home. All of these books address questions of how a place becomes home, how we treat or maybe mistreat the places we call home, how our homes impact and shape us over generations, who we share our homes with, both our human neighbors and our more than human neighbors. And also many of these books share the stories of those who have been forced from their homes or displaced from their homes. Braiding Sweetgrass connects with so many of the other books that I read from Milkweed and provides a really great frame for thinking about land and place and home. And the author, Robin Wall Kimmerer, is a botanist and a writer and a mother and a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. In Braiding Sweetgrass, she gives us stories, many based on her own life, of how our relationship as humans our relationship with the land has been broken. And then Kimmerer offers ideas for healing that relationship with the land. And her ideas are based on indigenous knowledge and practices and stories. And because she's a botanist, most of the stories are about plants. I love, for example, when she mentions how, we have this conception that we as humans have domesticated and cultivated plants. But when you think about it, we spend a whole lot of time feeding and tending and caring for our plant neighbors that sustain us and feed us, and we're kind of working on behalf of a lot of these plants. So maybe in a way they've kind of domesticated us to care for them. When she points this out, Kimmerer is questioning our assumptions, and when I say our assumptions, I primarily mean white European culture, consumer culture, capitalist culture assumption that we humans are at the top of the hierarchy of life, but actually we're actually pretty new to the scene, and maybe we should be treating plants as the elders that they truly are. In one chapter, Kimmerer visits a site of really devastating natural destruction. This land and lake area have been completely poisoned by industry. And the local population has really been at a loss for how to reclaim the land and clean it up. And they're not really coming up with any good solutions. But then Kimmerer visits the site and she sees that plants are already moving in and they're actually already starting to clean the land and the water and having a positive impact on this poisoned landscape. They're starting to heal the land. And she uses this example to emphasize an indigenous worldview that elevates plants as our teachers. Again, plants have been around longer than humans. They've figured out a lot about the world that we could learn from. But all the chapters feed into what I think is Kimmerer's central argument, which is that stories and language change how we see and treat the world around us. And if you look at a particular culture's stories and language, it will tell you a lot about how that culture treats the land and treats the more than human world and treats other humans too. So like take, for example, these two different cultures' creation stories. So on the one hand, you have the Skywoman story of the indigenous nations of the Great Lakes region. And Kimmerer tells the story. It's not my story to tell, so I'll link to it below. But one of the central points of this story is that the Sky Woman, when she falls to Earth, she ends up creating a garden. She creates a garden to sustain all of life on Earth. She's a gardener. So compare that to the story of Eve, who takes an apple from a tree in a garden and is then banished from the garden. So you have a gardener, a tender of a garden, a caretaker of the garden, a creator of the garden versus banished from the garden. Just think about how just the differences between those two stories impact the way two different cultures see the world and see kind of the life that surrounds us in the world and what our responsibility to that life is. And then for me, this all kind of brought to mind another set of stories, and that is the stories that you find in marketing. So for example, product marketing in a consumer society is nothing more than a set of stories built to tell us that we need something to like fuel this consumer society by creating a story that we never have enough, that we always need to be buying more. You need these products in your life. And we internalize that story that we see everywhere. Everywhere we see marketing for things that we need to buy. And that story becomes a part of who we are and how we live our lives and how we see the world. And you compare that to some of the indigenous stories that Kimmerer gives as examples in Braiding Sweetgrass, where the moral of those stories is to take only what you need, or ask permission before taking something, like asking a wild leek for permission before harvesting it, or never taking the first wild leek that you see so you can make sure you're not taking the last wild leek. Kimmerer also notices that in English, even our grammar reinforces the belief that humans are like the highest in the hierarchy of life. So in English, I see a spider over there crawling on the wall, and I would call that spider an it. Whereas in some of the indigenous languages that Kimmerer references, including the language of the citizen Potawatomi Nation, that spider is a her. There is no way in the language to refer to the spider as an it. The spider would be a her or a him or a they. And I would be maybe less likely to kill a spider that I think of as a she than a spider that I think of as an it. Calling her a she elevates her to the same level grammatically as me. I'm also a she. Of course, we don't actually kill spiders in our house. We actually let spiders live. So just putting that out there. We like spiders here in our house, and we appreciate what they do for us. In the end, Kimmerer emphasizes that writers really have a huge role to play in healing this broken relationship with the land, because writers are the ones who are creating and promoting and putting out into the world the stories that we internalize. Our storytellers are the ones who help us understand our place in the world. And I want to stick with Braiding Sweetgrass for just one more beat to talk a little bit about my experience coming at this book from the perspective of someone who lives in a really dense urban area. Kimmerer expresses multiple times how our relationship with the land has been broken and how living in urban spaces can actually deepen that rift between us and the land. And admittedly, us city dwellers perhaps have a tougher time connecting to the land because we aren't surrounded by lots of plants and animals. We're surrounded by lots of people and buildings. But I'm afraid that like someone could come at that and read that as a city dweller and think that the solution is to escape the city to connect with nature. But I don't think that Kimmerer is saying that the solution is for all of us city folk to hop on a plane and use up a bunch of jet fuel so that we can go be alone on a mountaintop or raft down a river. I think it's really important for those of us who maybe live in a more urban setting and are reading this book to think about connecting with the land that we actually live on, regardless of the human population density of that land. And I think Kimmerer would agree there, because saving the planet isn't about saving it so that a privileged set of us can go visit beautiful remote places. And there's a strong argument for city life actually maybe being a better choice for the planet. You live with a smaller footprint. It takes less energy to get from place to place. But then how to solve this problem posed by Kimmerer of city dwellers feeling disconnected from the land. And personally, I think there's a lot to be said for the humble walk around the block, noticing the plants and the birds and the squirrels and the dirt and the wind that surround you in the place you live. So like we have a pair of black-capped chickadees and a downy woodpecker that we love to watch out our front window that hang out on the tree out there. And there's a tiny spot around the corner where we know we'll always see the very first snowdrops of the season. It's not flashy, it's not Instagram worthy, but it is a more humble way to connect with the world, and I think Kimmerer would approve. I also read World of Wonders by Amy Nezuka-Matatil, and this was published in 2020. And these are short essays. The author, Amy Nezuka-Matatil, is a poet, and it's paired with, the essays are paired with gorgeous illustrations by the artist Fumi-Mini Nakamura. And each essay is centered around a different animal or plant. The essay either features an interaction that Nezuka-Matatil had with that animal or plant, or the essay is using that creature or plant as a kind of metaphor for something going on in the author's life. So for example, a cactus wren is an entryway into an essay about the author's childhood in 1980s Arizona, where this gaggle of kids kind of has the run of their neighborhood after school while their parents are working. That was one of my favorite essays. And then in one essay, a narwhal serves as a metaphor for the pod that her family kind of creates in order to navigate these icy winters of a Kansas neighborhood and to deal with the racism that they're encountering there. So we follow the author all around the world. She moved a ton when she was a kid. She seems to move a bit as an adult too, but then there are also essays on vacations and other family visits. So we see her in Mississippi, Arizona, Kansas, India, Greece, Western New York, all over the place. And for me, this collection kind of asks the question of what a person needs in order to call a place home. And I think a big part of that is finding the role of wonder in your surroundings and making you feel like you are at home with your surroundings and noticing the other life around you. And World of Wonders really reminded me of Braiding Sweetgrass in the way that Nezuka-Matatil elevates plants and animals to the role of teachers in most of these essays. And in an interview with Terrain.org, Nezuka-Matatil says, "My not so dirty secret is I actually read more science and natural history books than I do literature." And I think this speaks to a point that Kimmerer kind of makes too, that there's so much that we can learn from the more than human world, but we actually need writers to be able to translate the languages of the plants and the animals and the rivers and the mountains for us so that we can access them. And then in that same interview, she says, "I think when anybody reads an experience so far different from their own, they might have a little more tenderness and understanding towards each other." And that's like a common claim of reading, right? That reading builds empathy. because you can see the experience of someone else. But usually that's an argument used for like building empathy towards other humans. And what I think Nezuko Matato is saying here is that reading can help us build empathy towards other animals, and maybe empathy towards plants, and maybe empathy towards rivers and mountains. I mean, why not? And then Nezuko Matato also emphasizes the power of naming and knowing the names of the life that we share the planet with, which is also a point that Kimmerer makes in Braiding Sweetgrass. So it's not just a tree and a bird outside my window, it's a green ash and a house sparrow. So giving those beings actual names makes me feel closer to them, like knowing that's a green ash tree and that it's a house sparrow makes me feel closer to them. And this helps combat something that Kimmerer brings up also in Braiding Sweetgrass called species loneliness. And it's a term for the kind of sadness that humans experience that's brought about by this feeling of isolation from other species, and therefore from the rest of the world. So it's like an actual phenomenon, species loneliness. And Nezuko Matato combats this species loneliness too by giving each of these chapters the name of a plant or an animal. So it's not just a tree, it's a catalpa tree. It's not just a bird, it's a cactus wren. And then finally, in an interview with Triquarterly, Nezuko Matato gets at what I was saying a little bit earlier about connecting to the land through everyday experiences of where you actually live, since not everyone has the ability to escape into the wilderness. And so Triquarterly says, one thing I really love about World of Wonders is that you often consider marvelous and astonishing parts of the natural world through a lens of daily routines and familiar settings. I think a lot of narrative nonfiction about nature winds up being intentionally or unintentionally elitist, in that the writer decides to run off into the woods without worrying about money or a job or other obligations. And then Nezuko Matato responds that nature writing often assumes being outside or away from any other obligations is easy and accessible and safe for all. I always felt like those experiences were just not made for a large segment of the country's population. And then she goes on and says, my relationship with the outdoors is absolutely informed by having two Asian parents and now trying to be a present partner and parent myself, all while navigating spaces that are primarily white. And I just thought that was particularly poignant. I also read Sinkhole by Juliet Patterson. This was published in 2022, and I do want to note that this book is about suicide. So I'm going to pause here for a couple of seconds to give anyone a chance to skip ahead to the next book if you would like to do so, or if you feel like you need to do so. So this is a book, it's a memoir about the legacy of suicide in the author's family. So Juliet Patterson lost her father and both her grandfathers on her maternal and paternal side to suicide. And in the memoir, Patterson tries to understand their deaths, but then also learn more about their lives, partially to explore what she's inherited in terms of trauma and grief, but also in terms of mental health. And that doesn't sound like a book about land necessarily, but it actually is very much about land and home and the environment. So Patterson lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but she travels here in the book. She travels to Kansas, where both sides of her family are from and lived for, I think, 3 generations. And her family are from a region of mining towns in Kansas, and specifically she returns to one particular town called Pittsburgh, Kansas. And Patterson does a ton of research into the historical and political context of Pittsburgh, Kansas, and the surrounding towns. And she really digs into her family's arrival there and then life there. And the mines in this area have left behind an incredibly scarred, toxic landscape. And as Patterson explores her personal loss and trauma, she's very much also researching the loss and the environmental loss and trauma that the people of this area have inherited as well. And at one point, she even wonders if the environmental damage and contamination had some sort of effect on the mental health of her family. And that made me think of several of these books from Milkweed, which bring up this idea that the environment around our homes and our broken relationship with the land impacts our health in so many seen and unseen ways and can leave generations of scars emotionally, mentally, and physically. And in an interview with The Rumpus, she says, "Part of unearthing the story of my grandfathers was unearthing the place they lived. It felt as essential to me to know as knowing about their lives. It helped make them understandable." And then in another interview with Hippocampus magazine, the interviewer does point out the huge role that land plays in the book, and Patterson says, in grief, my senses were also heightened, if not distorted, and my relationship to the land and natural world magnified. It's difficult to describe, but I think I had an elevated sensitivity to the land, which some of the writing I did reveals. And while she's in Kansas, Patterson encounters literal sinkholes, including one that's only like a few doors down from her grandmother's house. So what actually is a sinkhole? A sinkhole is a void that lurks under the surface of the land, and then with the right environmental conditions, it collapses without warning, swallowing everything above it and around it. And sinkholes are frequent occurrences in this area of Kansas, in this mining region. But then the sinkhole also serves as a metaphor that the whole book is built around. How a void that was, in fact, always there, lurking under the surface, can suddenly reach the surface. And that symbolizes the trauma in Patterson's life and the legacy that suicide left on her family. And again, when countering this metaphor, I thought of Robin Wall Kimmerer again, who says in Braiding Sweetgrass, metaphor is a way of telling truth far greater than scientific data. And again, she's pointing to the power of specific techniques of storytelling and how those techniques can shape how we see and interact with the world. I also read The Life and Death of a Minke Whale in the Amazon by Fabio Zucker, and it's translated from the Portuguese by Ezra E. Fitz, and this was published in 2022. It includes beautiful illustrations and like this really cool orange text used for like the headers and the page numbers, and the hand-drawn images are actually illustrations from an indigenous artist named Gustavo Caboclo. And I mentioned in my first Milkweed video that we can't talk about place without talking about displace. And so this particular book is a collection of essays from journalist and anthropologist Fabio Zucker, who has gathered stories and voices from the Brazilian Amazon. And Zucker has spent a significant amount of time with the people of the Amazon, both indigenous and non-indigenous communities, learning how capitalism-driven deforestation and other forms of habitat destruction not only forever alter vital ecosystems, but also destroy entire communities' ways of life and significantly raise these communities' likelihood to fall into poverty and poor health. A lot of the chapters were articles that were initially printed elsewhere, including the title essay, which is a sad, true story about a Minke whale who made their way up the Amazon and into one of the tributaries and got stuck. It tells the story of how the local people were desperately trying to save the life of this whale, and it just is this whole sad saga. Zucker really dives deep into how the people in this region have a long, long history of being displaced by governments and corporations. Just to give one example highlighted in the book, in the 1970s, the Brazilian government took an interest in preserving the Amazon rainforest, but they had this idea that a virgin rainforest needed to be completely uninhabited by people. They forced all of these indigenous communities to move so that they could have this, virgin rainforest. And that displacement continues today due to various corporate and governmental and environmental factors that are forcing people off their land. These people have to abandon generations of skills built upon their life in the Amazon, and then they're forced to move to urban areas, but they don't have these generations worth of skills built up to live in an urban area. So Zucker reports on how they have to enter Brazilian society with absolutely no way to provide for themselves or their family. And then monoculture is actually a topic that comes up in several of the books I read from Milkweed, including some of the novels. And it's a big, big topic here too. And in the Amazon, the biggest issue is with soybean fields, specifically, that are devastating the land and its communities. And my understanding is that most of these soybeans are grown to feed livestock. Fields of only one crop are very unhealthy for the land, and a ton of pesticide and herbicide needs to be used. Whereas, indigenous practices might have had a natural solution for some of these pests, but the pesticides and herbicides are being used and poisoning the land and poisoning the people. And Zucker talks to a lot of these people from these communities and reports on the kind of all the different kinds of health problems that they are having as a result of this poison. And people are left with no choice but to sell their land and move to the city because they're either falling ill or they're being pressured to sell. And one of the author's goals with this collection of essays, as he says, is to reflect on the myriad forms of life in this region, starting with the relationship between people and plants. And he says plants aren't just there to be used according to human interest. And he writes that indigenous people in the region call into question the concept of human exceptionalism, of people as being separate from the world around them, which is theirs to dominate. And Kimmerer makes the exact same argument in Braiding Sweetgrass that we were just talking about earlier, that to take English, for example, our very language elevates humans to the top of this hierarchy when not every culture sees the world that way. So it was all the more powerful to read this right alongside Braiding Sweetgrass, to be reminded that this is a global phenomenon and problem, and to see the same forces being played out in a completely different part of the world. Of course, this book was written and published during the far-right presidency of Bolsonaro, and Brazil's new president, Lula, may perhaps enact positive change for the people of the Amazon region, but I guess we'll just have to see. And then finally, I read Graceland at Last by Margaret Renkl, and this was published in 2021. And this is a collection of Margaret Renkl's columns published in the New York Times between 2017 and 2021. And these columns are stories from her home in Nashville, Tennessee, but also stories from all around the South in the United States. And these essays explore the South from many different angles. So you have ecological angles and economic and political and social and cultural and just pure personal stories from Renkl's life. And Renkl is really open about her complicated relationship with the South. She loves her home. She absolutely loves her home, but she isn't blind to the many, many problems that exist in the South, complex problems. And again, this book very, very much follows in the spirit of Braiding Sweetgrass, in that all of these essays are about sharing space and sharing our homes with our neighbors, both human and more than human. She has a great piece right at the beginning about her backyard, which she shares with a hawk, a lizard, and a mole. And I learned that moles are actually good for the land because they aerate the soil and they eat pests. Dad, are you listening? There's a chapter about a garden club that's completely dedicated to removing non-native and invasive species from yards and gardens around the community. And human neighbors feature prominently too. And one of the absolute best essays is about a community of neighbors coming together to physically bar ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the United States. So they bar ICE from entering their neighbor's home. And then another favorite piece of mine was about the Nashville Chew Crew, which was founded by a guy who brings a herd of sheep and a sheepdog named Dougie into these overgrown landscapes, so like forest preserves and like even areas like along highways and stuff. So he brings these sheep in to remove invasive plant species as a first step in the land restoration process. So he actually like put up a temporary fence, and he leaves the sheep and his dog out there like overnight for multiple days until the sheep have cleared the land and eaten all the plants, and they just hang out there inside the fence and eat away. And then once they're done, they can move on, and people can go in and reintroduce native species of plants into the area. And once again, to me, this speaks straight to Robin Wall Kimmerer's point in Braiding Sweetgrass about how our first step in healing our relationship with the land is to turn to other species and see how they might approach it. In this instance, sheep. So those were the nonfiction books that I read from Milkweed, and there are tons, and I mean tons, more amazing pieces of nonfiction that you can find on Milkweed's website. I'm going to highlight a few more here, and these are just recent or upcoming releases, but please visit their website for much, much, much more. A book that just came out in February is A Darker Wilderness, Black Nature Writing from Soil to Stars, edited by Aaron Sharkey. And it says this is a vibrant collection of personal and lyric essays unearthing evidence of the ways Black people's relationship to the natural world has persevered through colonialism, slavery, state-sponsored violence, and structurally racist policies like Jim Crow and redlining. Coming out in April is a book called Losing Music, a memoir by John Cotter. And this is a devastating memoir of the author's diagnosis of Meniere's disease, and it sheds urgent, bracingly honest light on both the taboos surrounding disability and the limits of medical science. Coming in May is Soil and Spirit, Cultivation and Kinship in the Web of Life by Scott Chaskey. Scott Chaskey has been a farmer for decades and is a leader in the International Community Supported Agriculture, or CSA, movement. And it says that he has combined a long-standing commitment to food sovereignty and organic farming with a belief that humble attention to microbial life and diversity of species provides invaluable lessons for building healthy human communities. And in July, coming out as part of Milkweed's gorgeous Seed Bank series, these books are so beautiful, is Walking the Ojibwe Path, a memoir and letters to Joshua by Richard Wagamese. And this description says that in Ojibwe tradition, fathers walk their children through the world, sharing the ancient understanding that we are all living on the one pure breath with which the Creator gave life to the universe. So this is a series of letters from the author to the 6-year-old son from whom he was estranged. And Wagamese fulfills this traditional duty of father to child by describing his own path through life, but braiding this personal story with the teachings of his people, in which animals were the teachers of human beings until greed and desire to control the more than human world led to anger, fear, and eventually profound alienation. Again, that sounds a lot like the species loneliness we were talking about a minute ago. And then out in August, we have The Quickening, Creation and Community at the Ends of the Earth by Elizabeth Rush. And in this book, Elizabeth Rush documents the voyage of 57 scientists and crew who set out for the Antarctic to the Thwaites Glacier. And their goal was to learn as much as possible about this glacier, which is melting and has the potential of having as it melts, having a catastrophic impact on global sea level rise. But then along this journey, the author takes readers on a personal journey around a more intimate question. What does it mean to bring a child into the world at this time of radical change? And then coming out in November is Cacophony of Bone by Carrie Nidocherty. This is the story of Carrie and her partner Em in 2019, 2 days after the winter solstice. They moved to a remote cottage in the heart of Ireland, and they were looking for a home, somewhere to stay put, but what followed was the year 2020, and it says it's fragmentary in subject and form, fluid of language. This is an ode to a year, a place, and a love that changed a life. And you may have seen Carrie Nedocherty's other book around. This came out in 2022, I believe. I've seen this cover everywhere. It's called Thin Places, A Natural History of Healing and Home. And it says it's a luminous blend of memoir, history, and nature writing, and exploring how nature kept the author sane and helped her heal. And the author asks us to reclaim our landscape through language and study, and remember that the land we fight over is much more than just lines on a map. It will always be ours, but at the same time, it never really was. Another book that came out in 2022 is Conversations with Birds by Priyanka Kumar. And this is a lively collection of essays by acclaimed filmmaker and novelist. And it says, growing up at the feet of the Himalayas in northern India, Kumar took for granted her immersion in a lush natural world. And then she moved to North America as a teenager and found herself increasingly distanced from more than human life. So the collection really brings to life the avian world then as it traces her movements across the American West. Also came out in 2022 is Diary of a Young Naturalist by Dara McAnulty. And Dara McAnulty at the time was a 16-year-old globally renowned figure in the youth climate activist movement. And this is a memoir about loving the natural world and fighting to save it. If any of those books sounded great to you, I hope you'll hit that like button. It'll help this video spread across the interwebs and hopefully get these books into the hands of more readers. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.